In this video, I'm going to be talking about 9-2 fractions in simplest form. We first need to talk about what simplest form means. The simplest form of a fraction is when the numerator and the denominator have no common factor other than 1. So the numbers are pretty simple, which is why it's called simplest form. If I have something like 2/3, the only factors of 2 are 1 and 2, and the only factors of 3 are 1 and 3. So the only factor that they have in common, their common factor, is 1. That means that I can't get any equivalent fraction that's smaller, or rather has smaller numbers, than 2 and 3, 2/3. But if I had something like 10 out of 15, 10's factors are more than just 1 and 10. I could have 2 and 5, or 1 and 10. 15, I have 1 and 15, or 3 and 5. If you see, they have a common factor of 5, which is bigger than 1, so it's not in its simplest form. If I divided the top and bottom by 5, I would actually get 2/3, which then would be the simplest form. Let's practice finding simplest form ourselves. One way that you can find simplest form is by dividing the top number and the bottom number by a small number like 2 or 3 or an easy number like 5 over and over again until the top and the bottom don't have any common factor aside from 1. So I right off the bat know that I can divide both 12 and 100 by 2. If I divide the top and the bottom by 2, I get 6 over 50. Now I'm just going to keep going, dividing by small numbers like 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, something that's easy and small, until I can't go any further. So I notice again that both these are divisible by 2. And now I get 3 and 25. Now I need to work a little bit to make sure that there's no other common factor. Since the only factors of 3 are 1 and 3, I need to make sure that I could not divide this bottom number, 25, by 3. The only factors of 25 aside from 1 and 25 are 5 and 5. So the only common factor they have in 1 is 1, which means that 3/25 is the simplest form that you can get. Another thing that I could do, instead of dividing by small numbers over and over, is try and find a bigger factor that the two numbers, the numerator and denominator, have in common. So I could divide the top and the bottom by 2 over and over again, since these are nice even numbers, or I could do a little bit more investigating to see what the factors are. What I'm going to do is make a factor tree. A factor tree is when you start and find two factors other than 1, like 4 and 7, and then you see if you can make branches coming out of either of those, meaning do either of these numbers, 4 or 7, have factors besides 1 and itself. The only factors of 7 are 1 and 7, so let's think about 4. 4 could be broken down into 2 and 2. So that means that I could do 4 times 7, I could do 2 times 14. There are a couple different options. Now let's do the same for 42. Right off the bat, I know that 42 is divisible by 2, and when I divide that, I get 21. The only factors of 2 are 1 and 2, so I'm going to move over to the 21. 21 can be broken down into 3 and 7. So thinking about it like a factor tree, that means I could do 2 times these two together, 21, or I could do 6 times 7 to get 42. I could do 14 times 3. That's kind of how a factor tree works. It lets you know all the different combinations that you could get to make your top number. Anywho, I see that besides just 1, 28 and 42 have a couple different factors in common. I notice that they both have a 2 and a 7, which means that to get 42, I could do 2 times 7, which is 14, times 3. And for 28, I could do 2 times 7, 14, times 2. So they both have 14 in common. That's actually the biggest factor that the two shared. So we call it the GCF, greatest common factor. Greatest meaning biggest, and common meaning one that they share. They both have 14 in common. So now what we can do is just divide the top by 14 and the bottom by 14 to get 2 over 3. The only common factor that 2 and 3 have is 1, so that tells us that this number, 2/3, is in simplest form. So finding the greatest common factor can help you save some steps when dividing. However, it takes you a little bit more work on the front end. So it's up to you whether you want to just divide by 2 or 3 over and over again, a smaller number, or find a bigger number that they both share in common. If you didn't think of 14 right off the bat that these both share and you didn't want to make a factor tree, you could think of a smaller factor that they both share, but something that's maybe bigger than 2 or 3. In this case, I know that 7 goes into 28 and 7 goes into 42. So I might have also, instead of finding the greatest common factor, just found a bigger common factor, and like 7. What I would do is then divide the top and the bottom by 7 to get 4 over 6. Then I see that these both can be divided by 2. Oops. And then I would get 2/3, which is in simplest form. So this only took me 2 steps, which is a little bit more than if I had found the greatest common factor like up here, but also less steps than had I just divided by 2 over and over again. So to recap, a few ways that you can find the simplest form are to either divide the numerator and denominator by a small number that they both share as a factor, and just keep doing that over and over again until the only common factor of the top and bottom number is 1. Let's try that with this number up top here. I see that 30 is divisible by 2, but 45 isn't, so I can't divide the top number and the bottom number by 2 different things. Otherwise, I'm not dividing by 1. The only reason this all works is because when we divide by 1, we get a number with the same value that we started with. So I need to find something that they both have in common. I know this bottom number is divisible by 3, and 30 is also divisible by 3. So you don't always have to start with 2. In this case, I'm going to divide each of them by 3. 30 divided by 3 is 10, and 45 divided by 3 is 15. Now I see that these both have 5 in common. So I'm going to divide the top and the bottom by 5. When I do that, I'm really dividing by 1 whole, which gives me something that looks different, 2/3, but has the same value. Now let's look down below at maybe a simpler way that we could solve this. What I'm going to do is make a factor tree for each of these numbers, 30 and 45. I'm trying to think of bigger numbers that these each are divisible by than just 3. I know that 30 can be split into 3 and 10 can further be split into 5 and 2. And I can't make any of those any smaller because 3, 5, and 2 only have themselves and 1 as a factor. Let's look at 45. I know that 45 can be made up of 5 and 9. 9 can be split into 3 and 3. So what I want to look at is factors that both of these numbers have in common. In their factor trees, they each have a 5 and a 3. So with a factor tree, what you do is you would multiply those two together, 15, and you would multiply that by the other number that's left, in this case 2, and over here, 3 in the factor tree. So this means that the greatest common factor that 30 and 45 share is 15. So when I divide the top by 15 and the bottom by 15, I get 2/3, and since the only common factors of 2 and 3 are 1, that means that this is in simplest form. So either way, whether you take a couple steps and divide by 3, then maybe divide by 5, or find the greatest common factor and just begin by dividing with that, like 15 over 15, either way will help you get to the simplest form of a fraction. Try this one on your own. Figure out, using division, what the simplest form of this fraction is. Write it on your paper and bring it back to class tomorrow. Good luck!